In the last video, in our part 1 of converting our app over to Redux, we went over creating action creators and then wiring up the state and our action creators to a main component that we then attach to app. In this video, we're going to take the next step of creating reducers so that way they can act on those action creators and deal with doing stuff with our state. And then finally, we're going to hook everything up so that we start using Redux inside of our application. So to get started, if you'll notice, we started with app above. That's where we left off. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new array called initial state. And this just kind of gives us an idea of what kind of state we're going to have. It's going to be a JavaScript object with an ID of 0, completed false, and text as the text of our to-do. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a function called Todos, and it's going to take a parameter with a default of initial state. That way, if for some reason we ever call this a reducer without sending it a state, it's going to use the initial state. We're actually not going to hit that case with what we're doing, but I wanted to show it anyway. We not only pass in the state into our reducer, but we also pass in action with our reducer. And the action is from above where we have the action creators. With action creators, we call them. So if you look at remove to-dos above, we call remove to-dos and it returns a JavaScript object with type of remove to-dos. And then we take that JavaScript object, Redux does, and runs it through all of our reducers. So since it runs it through all of our reducers, we need to check for anything that wants to use remove to-dos or add to-do. So in that case, we're going to do if action type, since it's in our JavaScript object, equals add to-do, then we want to act on that. In this case, we're just going to return state and console log out the text of our to-do that we want to do. This way we see it in action, and we'll deal with actually adding it to state here in a little bit. We also want to again check for the remove to-dos, so we're going to do else if remove to-dos, and in this case we're just going to return an empty array. We're going to return an empty array because we want to remove everything from state, and action reducers modify state in some way, shape, or form. There's a little more nuance to it, but for now that's really all that you need to know, is that it'll modify state in some way, shape, or form. And then finally, we're just going to return state the way it is as it comes in, because if it doesn't need to do anything inside of each of these ifs, then this reducer doesn't matter for the action that was tried to be done. Next, we're going to set our root reducer, and it's going to combine all of our reducers. So we might actually have a bunch more reducers than just to-dos based on everything that we want to do with our actions. So we call a combine reducers, so it combines everything together, and we're setting to-dos from the function above, and we also want to add routing with a router reducer so that we can add all of our routing information into Redux, and so Redux can manage our routes. Next, we want to set our default state, and this is actually where we start with our state. And in this case, we just want it to start being empty so that we can act upon it later. And then finally, we need to create a store, and a store is kind of the last piece that you really need for doing Redux stuff. A store kind of is, in a sense, exactly what it is. You're storing all of the information in there, and it's kind of the place that says, hey, we created this action, we're going to do something, and then it runs it through all the reducers and then deals with setting state based on the default state that we have above. So therefore, we're creating store, and we're using the create store function call, and we're setting the root reducer so that it knows, hey, this is everything that needs to happen, and we're passing in default state, so that's the state that's passed in to each reducer. Then we're going to simply do history so that we can let Redux manage the history, and we're going to do sync history with store, so it sets the history, the browser history that we have actually below, it's syncing that with store, and then we're going to change what we have below to be history instead of browser history. So with that, we've kind of wired everything up, and we're ready to go to start using Redux. All we have to do is manage dealing with setting up our components properly. So let's go ahead and jump to the bottom, and we'll start modifying our routes. First thing we're going to do is we're going to add our provider, and this is a React component, and it's going to wrap all of our routes. And because it's where you set the store, so we're going to do provider store equals store, and everything's just going to kind of flow from there. The next thing we'll do is we'll change browser history to just history. Again, we're managing that with Redux with that sync browser with store. And then we're going to tweak the path route, the main path route, and we're going to set the component to app, which we set up above. And we're going to set an index route, which means that if there's no other matching paths that we've set, or routes that we've set with a path that matches anything other than the slash that we have above, then just by default use index route. And in this case, we're going to use the component of main page that we have set above. It's kind of a little bit confusing, as you kind of listen to it, but if you just stare at the code a little bit, it'll start making sense. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump up and start configuring our components. There's actually not a lot to do. So if we'll go up to remove to-dos, the component that we're setting here in our main page component, and literally remove the prop that we're going to be setting, and use a kind of a splat feature inside of JavaScript. We're going to say, hey, all of the props that are on main page, which are inherited from the provider essentially that's doing everything, let's pass those down into remove to-dos. So that means since Redux sets the state to props and the action creators to props, those are going to be available, so we want to pass those down. So in to-dos, we want to do the same thing. We're going to send all of the props down. And finally, the same thing in add to-dos. And since all of our actions that are happening are in our action creators above, and they're of similar names, and it's actually what kicks off the work that we want to do on state, we can go ahead and remove the initial state, add to do, and remove to-dos, because we have the equivalents that we need for Redux. So let's just remove those. If we'll keep moving up in our code, we'll get to our add to do, and you'll notice we're calling this.props.add to do, and we're passing in the text of our to do. That's it. That's all we need to do to deal with Redux, because it's the same name of add to do, and we're passing in the same information, and Redux already knows how to handle this. So go up a little more, and we'll look at our to-dos component. And again, to-dos is the state, the name of the state that we want to act on. And since it's on the props, it just automatically inherits the to-dos like this. So it's just going to work just fine. And then if we'll move up to remove to-dos, we need to do a little bit of tweaking. Remove to-dos is an action creator. And so we want to remove our local one in this particular component, because it only does one thing. It just removes everything. We don't need to necessarily use an intermediate function inside of our component. And we'll just tweak our this.removeToDos to be this.props.removeToDos, and then call a bind function. So it binds the function to the onClick instead of actually calling it when we load up the page. So that way it's basically assigning the function to this in a different way. So now when we click on the button, it'll do exactly what it's supposed to do. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and build it and run it in our browser. So here we go, we have it. If we click to-dos, because we have that in our main component, you see it doesn't do it. It does something, but it doesn't do anything. So in remove to-dos is there. Let's go ahead and take a look at our console, because that's where we're going to add our first couple of to-dos, just to kind of get an idea to see these things in action. And if we'll add hello world, you can see it's console logged, because in our reducer we set any text that we want to use for add to do, we want to console log it so that we can see that something actually happened. So with that in mind, let's jump back into our code. We'll go back down to that area, and we're simply going to add a new JavaScript object to our state. So in order to do that, we need to create a new array and start creating our object. In this case, we do the open curly brace, and we're going to set the ID. And we're going to set the ID to this little snippet that basically gets all the IDs in a current state and iterates it up one. Don't worry about it. You don't need to know it for the sake of this tutorial. Then we're going to set the completed to false as the default, and then we're going to set the text to be the action.todo. The action.todo is, again, it's the action creator that was passed in to our reducer here, and it's being called from our add to do component where we're passing in text, and to do is the actual text of our to do. So with that, we have added our JavaScript object of our to do to the state. However, if we just leave it like this, then nothing, it'll constantly keep returning this new one and it won't add any to it. So we need to do the little JavaScript splat thing to do ... state, which means it's going to unpack all the rest of the state, so all of the rest of the to-dos into this state and return it. So let's go ahead and see that in action in our browser. Go ahead and clear that and add our first to-do. And there we go. We have our first to-do in our list. So we know that'll work. So let's make sure that it adds another one. So we're going to add another one. And there we go. And just for posterity, let's add another. So we know adding these to-dos work. And now we want to check that our remove all to-dos works. And click on the button. And there we go. Removed all the to-dos. So we have successfully converted the main part of our application to add to-dos and remove to-dos to using Redux. And it actually was fairly simple once we got everything wired up. Now that we have everything wired up, in the next video, we're going to go ahead and add the actual component where the add to-do component to you start using Redux instead of using the internal state of that component. So join us next time and we'll see you then. Have a good day.